Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RSA House and the fabulous great room. And a very warm welcome too to those who are joining us online. I'm Henrietta Heald, your host for this evening. I'm a writer and I'm a fellow of the RSA, which, as you may know or not know, was formed 270 years ago as the Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. And it has continued throughout its history to champion all three areas of interest. Unlike the Garrett Club, which opened its doors 77 years ago, 77 years later, the Society admitted women from the start, although they were generally very few in number, as they have been for most of its history. But it is entirely appropriate that we are talking here today about women in industry and innovation. As a fellow of the RSA, I have attended many events in the Great Room, but it's the first time that I've actually been allowed on the stage. So for me at least, it is a very special occasion. And it is a setting that would have been very familiar to the woman who has brought us here today, Caroline Haslett, or Dame Caroline Haslett, as she became, making her the first female engineer in the UK, or anywhere. I mean, she was to be granted a damehood. She is shown here in a portrait of the early 1940s by Sir Gerald Kelly, which was commissioned by the RSA when she joined the Council of the RSA in 1941. And the original is currently on loan to the National Portrait Gallery. Caroline Haslett's name may not be very familiar to you, as it wasn't to me when I began to research my book, Magnificent Women and Their Revolutionary Machines, which is a centenary history of the Women's Engineering Society. Caroline was the first secretary, meaning administrator, of that society, which was founded in 1919. And 5 years later, she became the first director of the Electrical Association for Women, which you will hear a lot more about this evening. I came to realize that Caroline Haslett was one of the most significant and influential women of her generation, especially in regard to women's liberation and the advancement of their opportunities in the workplace. The generation we're talking about begins in the 1920s, immediately after the First World War, and continues through the Second World War, which was a very important era for Caroline, to the late 1950s, when she died at the age of 61. So imagine my delight when I saw her included in the RSA Journal celebrating 270 years. She was selected as one of the 50 most prominent fellows of the Society in its long history, and she was one of the only 2 women in the list to have been born before the start of the 20th century. I shall leave it to my colleague Anne Locker, who's here on stage with me, to tell you more about Caroline's life and her extraordinary achievements. But I wanted to say a bit more about her connection with the RSA. Caroline was elected a Fellow of the Society in 1934, and from 1941 to 1955 was a member of the Council and a Vice President. She was indeed the first female member of the Council since the Society's founding in 1754. And I'm glad to say there is a room in this building named after her. At the time of her appointment, there would have been only a handful of women fellows, probably fewer than 10, in a total membership of 4,000. That means that the female representation then was less than 3%. Today, the RSA has more than 30,000 fellows, of which women make up 33%, an 11-fold increase in 80 years. A great improvement, you will agree, but perhaps still not good enough. However, we may at least have quelled the concerns voiced by a veteran council member, Sir Ernest Goodall, in an obituary for Caroline, which he wrote after her death in 1957. It was with some apprehension that the council nominated a lady for the first time to join that body in 1941, wrote Goodall, but this boldness was fully repaid because it was Caroline Haslett who was elected to break the ice. She soon endeared herself to her fellow members and showed that a member of her sex had much to contribute to the works of the council. Moreover, she made her contribution in such a practical and natural way that we were soon wondering why we had been so slow in taking what was, even in 1941, thought to be so radical a step. So Sir Ernest captures here the quintessential nature of Caroline's character and modus operandi. Although she was extraordinarily influential in advancing the cause of feminism, this was long before feminism became a dirty word, and it was a word that she herself used often. But Caroline was not a flamboyant character, and as a woman engineer, she has been largely disregarded by history. This is part of a pattern. For far too long, and to the detriment of us all, women in engineering have not been taken seriously enough. How this is changing and what we can do, inspired by the Haslett story, to open up many more opportunities for women in industry and innovation, is a central theme of today's discussion. I hasten to add that I myself am not an engineer, so I am thrilled to have with me on the stage two engineers who know and understand the profession inside out. But first, I should like to introduce you to Anne Locker, the archivist at IET, the Institution of Engineering and Technology, based in Savoy Place, just down the road from here. And Anne is the custodian of the records of both the Women's Engineering Society and the Electrical Association for Women, the EAW. This year, 2024, marks the centenary of the founding of the EAW, and our event here at the RSA is part of a nationwide festival called Electric Dreams, celebrating her anniversary. Dawn Bonfield, in the centre, started her career as a materials engineer and rose to become president of the Women's Engineering Society. She was lured into academia and now has too many titles for anyone but herself to remember. Here are some of them. She is Professor of Practice Engineering for Sustainable Development at King's College London. She's President of the Commonwealth Engineers Council, and she's Royal Academy of Engineering Visiting Professor at Aston University. No one is better placed to talk about the situation of women in engineering today and how we can draw on the stories of the past to inform our hopes and ambitions for the future. Yasmin Ali, our third panel member, is a chemical engineer and the author of a fascinating new book called Power Up, which draws on her own experiences in the energy industry to explain in very clear laywoman's terms where we get energy from, how it is moved and used around the globe, and why we need to understand the whole system if we want to transition to a cleaner, greener future. Yasmin will talk about how the position of women in industry and engineering is changing and give examples of the exciting opportunities that are opening up in many areas, both in the energy sector and beyond. The talks will be followed by a brief panel discussion, and we shall then invite questions from the audience, so please think about what you might like to ask. People who have joined us online can put questions in the chat. So I should now like to invite Anne to share her insights into Caroline Haslett's life and achievements. Thanks, Anne.
Good evening. My name's Anne Locker, and I'm the Library and Archives Manager at the IET, and we're lucky enough to hold the personal archive of Dame Caroline Haslett, as well as the archives of the Women's Engineering Society and the Electrical Association for Women. This is me. So this evening, I want to give you a brief overview of the astonishing life and work of RSA fellow Dame Caroline Haslett. And among her many achievements, as Henrietta has said, she was a pivotal figure in establishing the Electrical Association for Women in 1924 and making it a success. Henrietta has spoken about her work with the RSA, but these weren't the only two organisations that she worked with, because Caroline Haslett was one of the most highly networked and frankly busiest women in the history of 20th century engineering. She knew everybody and she did almost everything. If there was a committee, an organisation, a charity, a campaign that had anything to do with women in engineering or women in business, she was there. And for example, this is a British Electricity Association dinner. Spot the lady. So this is all the great and the good of the electrical engineering industry in the UK in the 1950s. And there is Dame Caroline Haslett at the back. And this is not an uncommon kind of photograph of engineering situations in the UK at this time. So if we start with a summary of some of her achievements, she was the first secretary of Women's Engineering Society in 1919, founder of the Electrical Association for Women, first president of the British Federation for Business and Professional Women, advisor to Ernest Bevin on engineering in World War II, president of the International Federation for Business and Professional Women. She was the first woman to head a government working party for industry. She was the first woman to sit on the British Electricity Authority. She worked at the United Nations and the International Labour Organization. She campaigned for equal pay and flexible working. Frankly, there's a lot, especially as she had to retire due to ill health in her late 50s and died aged only 61. But this evening, I want to pose two questions. How did she do it? And why isn't she better known? So if we start at the beginning, Caroline was born in 1857 and she came from a pretty modest background. Her father worked on the railways and she wasn't a particularly good student. She didn't really excel at school. Her first success was when she joined the Cochrane Boiler Company in World War I as a secretary. She ended up running the London office and persuading the owners that she should train in the boiler works to get more technical knowledge. In 1919, she left Cochrane to take her new role as first secretary to the Women's Engineering Society, which had just been founded. And here's a picture from the WES first annual conference back in 1923 in Birmingham. So the Women's Engineering Society was founded in 1919 by women who'd gained engineering experience in the First World War, like Caroline, and wanted to carry on in the profession, despite huge barriers. And WES is the first professional organisation for women engineers in the world by quite some margin. In the WES archives at the IET, we can see how good Caroline was at running things. She was very good at managing the founder and the later president, Lady Parsons, which was not always an easy job. She set up the first journal, and she also spotted that there was one strand of engineering, electrical engineering, that she thought was going to become really important. WES covered and still covers, it's still going strong today, all forms of engineering. But from the mid-1920s, Caroline focused her engineering interests on electricity, especially the new technologies coming into the home. She could see that domestic electricity had a unique potential for changing women's lives, all women, not just those working as engineers. It could replace a lot of the sheer drudgery of domestic work for small households and also solve the problem of recruiting domestic servants for larger ones. And here's a picture of Caroline at the time that she started as the first director of the Electrical Association for Women in 1924. The first thing that Caroline did was to use her administrative powers to get the new organisation up and running. She used the existing setup at WES to support the new organisation, and the two bodies shared secretarial support and office premises. The first notices and articles about the Electrical Association for Women were published in the WES Journal, before the EAW's own journal was set up in 1926. And here's one of the EAW tea towels they produced to inform women about electricity, and also they set up demonstration kitchens to show the new technology. As the EAW grew, the close administrative relationship with WES changed and the power balance flipped, and by the 1950s, it was WES that was using the EAW's premises and offices. And we can see a similar pattern with Haslett's work for the International Federation of Business and Professional Women. When she was elected president, she ran the federation from the EAW's London office. Now, as well as being an extremely competent administrator and manager, Caroline was an amazing networker. She knew everyone. She went to events, She took notes about people and connections that she could use later. And when she started to employ her own secretaries, she asked them for briefing notes on all the people she'd meet at events. And she played golf, which was a great way to make and build relationships in the engineering community. She hosted dinners, especially at the Hungaria Club, and she joined organisations like the RSA to meet and network with yet more people. And this is one of the articles she wrote in World War II about recruiting women into industry, and that's a photograph of Caroline Haslett at the launch of the Dame Caroline Haslett ship that was launched by the Electricity Authority. A brief survey of Caroline's correspondence held at the IET indicates that we hold at least 10,000 items of correspondence to or from Caroline in her various roles, and there must be more elsewhere. Her networks extended to the royal family. Queen Mary was a big supporter of EAW. Politics, industry, she was very good friends with Sir Stafford and Lady Cripps. The theatre, the diplomatic service, and networks in Canada and Australia. We're just starting to explore the extent of her international work, and it's likely to prove even more significant than we first thought. So we know she was a great administrator, a great networker, and was really successful. So why isn't she better known? I suspect there are a couple of factors at play. First, her main, although not her only contribution, was in engineering and industry. And the academic history of engineering has tended to focus on technology, inventions that changed the world and the people that invented them. Even the history of women in engineering has tended to focus on professional engineers and their achievements. The essential work of administration, management, and getting things done effectively and efficiently is sometimes a harder sell. And many people, quite wrongly I think the history of STEM is probably not that interesting anyway. If Caroline had been a politician or a single-issue activist, I think she'd probably be better known. The other factor is the time when she worked. The period between the First World War and the 1960s is sometimes seen as a little bit of a step back in terms of women's rights. After women got the vote and before the beginning of second-wave feminism, came an interim period, sometimes referred to as the age of democracy, women using conventional structures to achieve their goals. One article on the history of the British Federation for Business and Professional Women noted that it was a political organisation and a feminist one, but it used traditional, constitutional and bureaucratic means to achieve its objectives. And the author went on to say that women working in this way have never been popular or romantic feminist role models. But this is what makes Caroline Haslett so interesting. She doesn't necessarily fit our image of what an activist looks like in her very neat suits and hats, sitting demurely on tables with lots of conventionally successful-looking businessmen. But her steady, effective work helps so many people nationally and internationally. So let's look again at these achievements. Helping to set up the first professional body for women engineers, founding one of the first consumer organisations to amplify women's voices in a male-dominated industry, bringing people together from across the engineering, political and social worlds, working with the United Nations, putting women's voices at the centre of technical developments like the three-pin plug. And that essentially is her legacy. What she did was she got women's voices heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm Dawn Bonfield. I haven't got any slides, sorry, so you just have to look at this the whole time. So I was going to just tell you a little bit more about the campaign that we're running this year. It's called Electric Dreams, and Henrietta mentioned it a little bit earlier, and we're a group of volunteers who decided probably a year ago, at least a year ago, that we would work on this campaign. It's just too good an opportunity to miss. Even though the Electrical Association for Women doesn't exist any longer, their legacy is so inspirational and transformative that we thought it would be a really great thing to celebrate this year. So we're actually here. We've been talking about this this month of November for a good year, and you know, the last 2 months, the time has just sped up, I think, even though we've had a good run in. But so what we've been trying to do, we've obviously got a big focus on the history, you know, the transformative history of the Electrical Association for Women. But what we're trying to do is bring that conversation up to date and really start to look at what the conversation is and what the discussion points are today, partly around women and women's behaviours, but also around energy in general. So we know that those conversations need updating. You know, 100 years ago, Caroline Haslett and the Electrical Association for Women were very keen on as much use of electricity in the home as we could possibly use. So the home was completely full of appliances, and we were encouraged to use appliances for everything, to escape the drudgery, to get ourselves some free time, to really lighten the load for women in the home. And they were very successful in doing that. You know, we have electricity appliances everywhere in the home, you know, more and more and more of them. But today the conversations, I think, are very different. We know we're in this climate and biodiversity crisis, and we have to be really careful about the energy we do use. We're trying to reduce the amount of energy we use in the home, in the factories, in the workplace, and we're trying to move to renewable energy. But that's not an easy conversation to have, and we know very well, just from the newspaper and from the conversation in politics at the moment, that it is a very divisive area. Pylons in particular is becoming, you know, the big political issue of the day, where people don't want those pylons in their backyard or their front yard. Like they have, there's 2 guys down here from Three Bridges, where Caroline Haslett was born, and are trying to champion Caroline Haslett and the pylon that is very central to Three Bridges as a symbol, if you like, of power and of her legacy. So we really know that we have to get the public to engage in a positive way in these conversations, because if we don't do that, we know the consequence of people's actions being polarised, and we start to get this as a political football, and people end up one way or another. But we can't afford to do that. You know, we know 100 years ago that they didn't appreciate at the time that the planet's resources were limited. And there were so many fewer people on the Earth at that time. There were 2 million then. I think there are over 8 million now. We absolutely know the damage that we're doing by using energy and using electricity. So having these conversations is partly what this the kind of present day role of this Electric Dreams project is all about. We have a number of different strands as well. We have outreach strands, and one of the things that we've been doing, I've been doing, and we've got, and the Women's Engineering Society have also been doing, is trying to use this centenary to get more young people into engineering. And one of the things I've been doing in schools is replicating the first meeting of the Electrical Association for Women. And that's a really, really engaging meeting, and a way of introducing a discussion topic for young people, because it's only 100 years ago, but the values, if you like, and the thoughts of the day then were when women were really stuck in the home, in the kitchen. You know, they didn't work equally in society, and getting students to think back for that first meeting about how they needed to persuade people that this was a good organisation to start, by way of saying, well, of course, you know, women will look better if they can iron their clothes properly, and, you know, they will have more time to cook for you, you know, because they were really trying to persuade the men in the room, really, that this was a good thing and that women weren't going to, you know, take all of their jobs. So it's really interesting, and a woman comes over from the States, and she's very much, well, you know, you can have manicured nails like mine and beautiful skirts like I have, because I've got more time to look after myself. So getting students to talk about the history and think about the changes that this organisation brought about is an alternative way of getting more young people to think about careers in engineering than maybe going in with the traditional build a bridge type activities. So we found that to be a really engaging way of encouraging young people, and we still really do need to encourage young people into engineering. So, you know, we have, I think, for the first time in at least 10, 15 years, seen a reduction in the number of women working in engineering. The last figure we had was 16.5% of women in engineering. This year it's 15.7%. Actually, that represents more people leaving the industry than it does the lack of people coming into the industry. We are actually seeing an increase in young people coming into the industry, but we're seeing more people leaving. So we do have to think carefully about the conversations we're having around what the industry looks like that we're encouraging these young people into. Yeah, what else was I going to say? So that's really, I think, one of the other things we're doing is we've got a blue plaque campaign, and we're trying to raise the profile of a lot of these women that were involved in this organisation. So we've chosen, I think, 12 of them. We've got a virtual blue plaque campaign. So we've made the plaques and now they're on the website, so they do exist, but just not in reality. And then throughout November, we were hoping to get these actually stuck to the buildings where these people worked. So Jeannie Dix, that one there, she electrified Winchester Cathedral. Absolutely no mean feat. So she absolutely deserves a plaque. So yeah, we've got a few shops where she had a shop in Winchester that have agreed to stick that to their wall. Eleanor Shelley Rolls was another woman very much involved in the early days from Monmouth. I sat next to today actually the CEO of Rolls-Royce, Warren East, who's the president at the IET, and he is from Monmouth, I found out. So yeah, he's going to help me get this plaque installed in Monmouth. So yeah, so we've got a few things that we're doing that cross over the history and the future. Yasmin's going to talk more about the future, I think, but I think it's a really important way of using this centenary to rethink what it is we're doing. Oh, the other thing I was going to tell you was about campaigning. So one of the campaigns that we're thinking about is around use of energy, digital data, and how we don't really realise the cost of that energy, the carbon cost, if you like, of data that we use, every email that we get, every Google search that we do. So if I give you some of the stats around the amount of energy, so the internet, if you considered the internet as a country, it would be the 6th largest country by use of energy in the world. One internet search costs us 0.2 grams of carbon dioxide. One email costs 4 grams of carbon dioxide. Yasmin might be about to tell us something different here, but 3% of global carbon emissions come from data centres. And data centres are the place where they're holding all of these useless emails that we just don't bother to delete. So, you know, every time you get an out-of-office email, or you take 4 photographs when you could be taking 1, or you share those gifts on somebody's birthdays, you know, they cost us in energy because they're having to be stored in data centres. So it's around, you know, that as a behaviour change to get people into the habit of just deleting things when we don't need them, so that we're not storing all of this dirty data, it's called. So yeah, these are the sorts of behaviour changes that we're looking for. So I think that was what I was going to tell you about. Just to say a little bit more about Caroline Haslett before I finish. You know, I was president and then chief executive of WES, the Women's Engineering Society. And I was the first paid chief executive of WES since Caroline Haslett, because we've been a volunteer-led organisation which didn't have any money. And she has been a heroine of mine since I was president and CEO of WES, which is a good 10, 12 years ago now. And she was, for me, you know, we even today have this discussion about whether she was a real engineer or not, and we're quite elitist when it comes to engineering. You know, we have like a little ring around engineers, and we say, oh, well, you know, are you a proper engineer or are you not really a proper engineer? But we're looking at the skills of engineers and realising that we need all sorts of different types of engineers now, not just the ones that are very focused on something you know, technical, if you like. We need people who can work across boundaries with one another. And Caroline Haslett is the epitome of that sort of engineer. She was an absolute networker. She knew everyone. She was a great leader. She was a great campaigner. And like all engineers, she got things done. You know, she wasn't somebody who sat back and, you know, waited for other people to do things. She got in there, and she is the one on the inside. So if you want change to happen, oftentimes you need to be on the inside of these organisations, making things happen from the inside. And she was absolutely there in many of these organisations. So, and she amplified the voice of other people very effectively. So I'm so pleased that she is getting some more coverage, and she was even mentioned in the Houses of Parliament today by Peter Lamb, thanks to you down there, who put him up to the Crawley MP, who mentioned her. So she's getting some recognition at last. So it's great to be here and to celebrate Caroline Haslett. Thank you.
Try not to fall over on my way here. Hi everyone, my name is Yasmin Ali. I'm a chemical engineer and I work in the energy sector. So my aim over the next 10 minutes or so is to show the diversity of engineering and technical careers. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what I do, but also a bit about some other women who started out as engineers or are engineers and what they do, just to kind of scratch that surface of what you can do with a technical career. So starting with myself, I studied chemical engineering at university. I then joined the energy sector. I started out in power stations and in oil and gas. So I got to get into helicopters and go and visit platforms and oil rigs in the North Sea, which was all very exciting. But simultaneously, I was starting to feel more and more guilty about working in the oil industry after learning more and more about climate change and the impacts of fossil fuels. So that guilt eventually was resolved when I was made redundant from my oil and gas job. And I was forced to think about what to do next. So I worked as a control room manager for a district heating or heat networks business for a little while. And then I left and hopped over to renewables. I made a decision that I want to work on the energy transition. I don't want to do fossil fuels anymore. So I joined government, so that it was the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy back then. It's now called something else, but I was working on energy innovation funding and working just on clean technologies, and I absolutely loved it. So I probably should have made the move earlier, but you know, you live and you learn. So here I am. From there, I started to learn about hydrogen as a possible fuel that we can use, which has almost no emissions. And an opportunity came up with a company called RWE to go and work on green hydrogen projects. So I won't go into the ins and outs of that, but that's what I went over to do and where I work at the moment. So there are lots of areas of energy that I haven't worked in, but I'm very curious to learn and to see. So I will never say no to a visit to a wind farm, and have found myself on boats several times, visiting various wind farms in the UK and around the world. So I'm always trying to learn as much as possible. And on top of the engineering and that kind of energy side of things, I love writing. And a couple of years ago, started writing a series of articles for the Chemical Engineer magazine. So I wanted to talk to other chemical engineers and find out what they do and see where that degree can lead. So I want to tell you about 3 women that I spoke to while writing that. The first one is Olivia Sweeney. Olivia has very much a sustainability focus, and when I spoke to her a few years ago, she was quite early on in her career, and she was telling me that rather than applying for the big graduate schemes with BP and Shell, like all the other chemical engineers, she very purposely looked for companies that had a focus on sustainability. So she went for Ecova, if you've heard of them. They make cleaning products. She applied for Patagonia, who makes sustainable clothing. And she also applied for Lush, which is where she ended up. So she was the aroma chemicals buyer for Lush. So she was buying the nice smells that go into the products at Lush that we all smell when we walk past the shop. And since I spoke to her, she has left Lush, and her latest job, I looked her up, and she's working at the Clean Air Fund. So she's still very much driven by her values, and that chemical engineering background is going to take her far, I'm sure. My next person is Jaga Wise. So Jaga is the head brewer at Wildcard Brewery. And she's also a broadcaster, so you might hear her on radio or see her on TV. After studying, she worked in the water industry for a little while. She then wanted to move to London and got a job doing chemicals trading. And her speciality was chemicals for the paint sector. And she told me that it was like watching paint dry, so she didn't like doing that. And that was when she set up Wildcard Brewery with some friends and learned how to brew. She's a sommelier now. She's on the food program, which is on the radio, I think. And she's written a book about home brewing as well. So a completely different direction, but same starting educational background. And then the third person is Fiona McLeod. So Fiona worked in energy and in chemicals for more than 40 years. The last time that I met her, she was the managing director at Linemouth Power Station, which is in the northeast of England. She studied at Cambridge, and I'm going to read this quote from when I spoke to her. She said, "I had a tutor who told me there are two types of women, feminine and poor at maths, or unfeminine and good at maths. He proceeded to tell me that I was the first sort, and it made me so angry that I was determined to finish my course," which she did, and has had a very successful career. And not only is she an engineer, but has a real passion for languages, and she wanted to learn Portuguese and just moved over to Portugal when she was younger and got a job as an engineer, so she's fluent in Portuguese. And maybe about 10 years ago or so, she started writing crime fiction. So she writes under the name Fiona Erskine. She has written a whole series of books about a character called Jack Silver, who is a chemical engineer who gets mixed up in a lot of international crime and then ends up solving it. And then she's got a few other books that are not part of that series as well. So I think writing these short articles was amazing, and it wasn't quite enough for me. So I thought writing a full book would be a good next move. So I wrote Power Up, which brought together my life in the energy sector with my love for writing. And again, I'm going to pick 3 women who are in the book who I spoke to tell you about. The first one is Dr. Diana Casey. I've given them these titles in brackets, by the way. That's not what they call themselves. But she's a director at the Mineral Products Association. So her speciality is around decarbonisation of the cement sector, which is a really big contributor to emissions and climate change. She makes cement, which probably most people would think is really dull. She makes it quite interesting. And she's really good at explaining complicated things in a simple way, which I really appreciate. Next is Michelle Nesbitt, who I spoke to. So she's the co-founder of a company called Box Power. She's based out in the US. Box Power make microgrids, so these are very small electricity generation and distribution systems, and they're very useful for remote communities. So Michelle and the team have built these systems for people in Alaska who rely on diesel for their power. They've replaced those systems with solar panels and cheaper and more sustainable energy sources. She's also worked in areas in California where the power lines have been taken out by wildfires. So they've put up these microgrids for communities that got cut off their power supplies. And they've also worked in Puerto Rico where back in 2017, Hurricane Maria completely destroyed their power system. So they were able to get some communities back on power with these microgrids, which I think is really incredible. And then one of my favorite conversations was with Captain Tatiana Platina, who is the captain of a liquefied natural gas ship. So this is a ship that takes natural gas from wherever in the world and sails it to somewhere else that needs it. She is the captain of the BW Everett, and trying to remember when I spoke to her, I think she had started out maybe in Nigeria and was sailing to China, and she looks after the crew. She's responsible for the ship and has to think about things like what to do if there's a pirate attack, and how to keep the ship safe and all that kind of thing. So just to conclude, you've heard about my career in engineering and also 6 other women. I think, as I said at the beginning, that is just scratching the surface of what women and really anybody can do with a technical career. It can take you in many different directions. And I think what's important to highlight is a lot of these careers are very well paid, they are interesting and really meaningful, and I truly believe that more women should take advantage of this. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, after those 3 very stimulating presentations, I'm looking forward to hearing your questions. But before we move on, I want to explore one of Caroline Haslett's central arguments, which was eloquently expressed in the title of a book she published in 1949, which was called Problems Have No Sex. Caroline was, of course, referring in this title to an ideal, and she was using it to promote the idea of equal pay, and so on. But I know that it's an issue on which Dawn, for one, has strong opinions. Dawn, I believe you disagree that problems have no sex.
I think one of the things we're slightly guilty of is now women in engineering try not to own their female side. They try to be just an engineer. I don't want to be a woman, I want to just be an engineer. Whereas back then, 100 years ago, we were using engineering to make our lives better as women. But the thing I think about that particular statement is that engineering does actually have a sex. Gender comes into this. Henrietta said at the start that I'm president of the Commonwealth Engineers Council, and I work all around the world with countries who are not developed in the way that we are in the UK. And women have very, very different lives in those countries, and they have very different levels of access to information and to independence. And the engineering needs to serve a very different purpose for those women than it does today for our women who, I think in the UK we can kid ourselves that it's a very equal society and, we shouldn't be thinking about sex. But my work is around inclusion, so I work as an inclusive engineer, so I look at the outcomes of engineering and make sure that they are accessible to everyone, they don't have any bias embedded. But I think we need to be using engineering and targeting engineering for the purposes that it is needed for. We talk about escaping the drudgery, using electricity to escape the drudgery of everyday tasks. Well, women all around the world still have the drudgery of collecting firewood and collecting water and looking after people, family members who are sick. That is the women's role in those societies. So if we can create technology that helps them with those roles, that helps them get access to information, that helps them with their banking, then I think that's what we need to do. So yeah, that's my opinion of it.
Fascinating. Thank you, Dawn. So, is there any questions from the audience? This gentleman here, put your hand up first.
Sorry, thank you very much. A question for Dawn, actually. You mentioned about the number of engineers, youngsters coming into engineering. I'm a lecturer in engineering science and mathematics, and what I think part of the problem might be is that the career advisors are not well versed in engineering as a whole. And I think there's a pinch point, I think, at some point that needs to be addressed. So I don't know what your views on that is. And the other thing is that what about crypto mining establishes? How much carbon do they actually produce?
That's one for you. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of barriers for women coming in, young women coming into engineering. It's, you know, I think it's partly careers advisors, but it's also peers, it's parents, it's teachers. You know, it's just not the default choice for girls to come into engineering. And I think the girls that do manage to come into engineering have to go over that big barrier, and they have to be really determined. What you often find is that women in engineering are determined to get there. They don't sort of fall into it by mistake, if you like. So we've got to reduce that barrier. We've got to try and find ways of incentivising those girls to come through into engineering. But I do think that energy and climate change and sustainability are topic areas that young women feel are ones that they care about. You know, they do care about the planet, and I think that I'm hopeful that these are attractive enough to enable girls to get over those barriers and come into engineering.
Does Yasmin want to? I wasn't quite sure what the question about crypto mining was, but maybe.
Mining centres are very power hungry, and they must be producing a lot of carbon.
I don't know the number off the top of my head. But yeah.
You mentioned about how many grams of, but I'm sure you could work out how much.
Somebody right at the back, man right at the back.
Thank you. I think that one of the problems is that we've still got the idea that an engineer has oil under his fingernails and fixes your car, generally, no matter male or female. But one of the problems also is that I have a memory of an example of an engineer being a bit diffident themselves. There was, a good few years ago, a woman MP was a civil engineer. And she said in an interview that she started off in the House of Commons saying, "Oh, I'm just an engineer." But after a couple of years, she started saying, "I'm the one who keeps you alive." And I think that's a very important cultural point, that in fact, without engineering of all sorts, we would be up the creek and nobody would have invented the paddle. There was actually a half-day conference by the William Shipley group of the RSA, actually celebrating sewerage and health, which was certainly civil engineering.
Does anybody want to make a comment?
Well, I do think it has a misconception problem, and you know, one of the bugbears that I have is around the use of engineering on the railways, because the time that you hear engineering mentioned is because of delays, or you know, something's cancelled because of engineering works. And this morning it made me laugh actually, because the train was cancelled because of engineering works that had gone wrong, that had run over time. So it wasn't just bad engineering works, it was even taking longer than they should have been taking to inconvenience you. So it was like a double inconvenience. But yes, I think there is a misconception.
Anyone else? Gentleman there?
My name is John Cooban, and I live 5 doors along from the house in the Victorian Railway settlement of Three Bridges, now part of Crawley, where Caroline Haslett grew up, and in 1914, aged 19, set out for what turned out to be her remarkable career. As contributors, some of you will be familiar with the Caroline Haslett Memorial Project, which a group of Three Bridges residents started in 2018 to mark women's suffrage centenary year. The main geographical focus of the project has been an operational transmission tower, or pylon, in a prominent urban location close to Caroline's birthplace near Three Bridges railway station. Since our project's inception 6 or 7 years ago, with ideas about placemaking, townscape and modest public realm improvement associated with Caroline's memorialisation and legacy, to what degree would you say that perceptions and strategies aspiring to carbon net zero should come about as equal, if not more important, drivers than townscape of a project with links to electrical engineering? And does a shift towards engineering for carbon neutrality make it any more appealing as a career to women and girls? And finally, the Energy Networks Association published an Energy Networks Innovation Strategy in April this year. In its foreword, ENA Chief Executive Lawrence Slade describes the strategy as a roadmap for how network operators can innovate to support the net zero transition and tackle potential challenges to the UK's energy security. Our network operator, UK Power Networks, covering much of South East and East Anglia, appears to interpret such challenges as relating strictly to improvements of network resilience in a loading or capacity sense, very much separate from the public relational or cultural matters associated with our project.
Can I stop you for a minute? Because I think perhaps people might have a response to some of your,
okay,
if you've any more. I mean, I don't know if you want to say something.
I guess one of the points was around net zero versus what a place looks like, if I understood that correctly. And I think for me, if we don't get to net zero, or if we don't transition our energy system, there isn't going to be anywhere nice looking left. So for me, it's about that longer term thinking. And yeah, I think we do need the pylons. I work in the energy sector. A lot of the projects are struggling to get going because we can't connect to that electricity network. It definitely needs reinforcement, and I hope that people will be on board with more pylons because we have them, we're used to seeing them, and yeah, they're kind of necessary in my opinion.
Anyone else?
I think also sometimes we forget how long it took to set up that network in the first place, and these aren't new questions. So, you know, but it took decades to actually get round to the idea of a national grid and a national electricity distribution network, because it's difficult to do, and it's even more difficult to get everybody to agree to do the same thing at the same time. So these aren't easy questions, but also we've been struggling and dealing with them for well over a century in this country, and I could have managed to get some answers out of it anyway. So
I've got some more. Yes, woman here.
Hi, Charlotte Seeger here. Can I ask a question? Do you think this is just a problem for women in this industry or others? So, for example, I work in health.
Do you think you've got the opposite problem in health, and you have a lot of women that go into the health?
I work in digital, so no, I share your feelings, so yeah.
Yeah. I think that is one of the things that we don't do enough of. We think about women in engineering, but we don't see the holistic answer. You know, if you're thinking about schools, we have very, very good evidence that there's a lot of stereotyping in schools that goes on. But you can understand the stereotyping in some respects, because a lot of the data shows that girls and boys are pretty equal at science and maths. But girls are actually good at something else rather than science and maths. They're good at the English and the humanities and the arts. So schools, you know, understandably, I suppose, send the boys into the things that they're best at, and they send the girls into the things that they're best at. But what you're trying to do, I suppose, is you know, you have to have an idea of where the jobs are, where the future jobs are. And I think we need to find a way of incentivizing people to work in areas where we have a need. So you know, I think if that means we have fewer people going into certain subjects, then I think that's what we've got to think about. Because we're in a climate crisis. We don't have time to waste, you know, not getting people to work on these pressing problems that we have. So I don't think I think, you know, we have to look at the implications, I suppose, of not just engineering, but the whole system really, why it is we're encouraging, why it is that, you know, careers teachers or whoever encourage girls into different subjects. If you look at girls' schools where there's only girls in the school, girls happily go into all of the subjects there, obviously. So, yeah, I think we do need to look around at the other subjects and the implications that we're having on those subjects as well by trying to get more girls into engineering.
Can I just take a question from the online, which was, as a young woman starting a career, do you have any advice for me? I don't know if you'd like to address that, Yasmin.
I'm not that young anymore. Yeah, I think one thing that I say to people who are starting in their career, because it's something I felt at the beginning of mine, was this pressure to pick the perfect job and to know what you want to do. But I think now, like 15 years into my career, I know that if I do something and I don't like it, I can swap, and you're always learning from those experiences. So I would say seize those opportunities and don't put too much pressure on yourself to pick the perfect job at the beginning.
Yeah, good. Sorry, there are lots of hands going up. There's a woman at the back.
Thank you. It was really interesting to hear about the gender diversity in this country. How come in Lithuania and Norway they've got much more gender equality in engineering? What are they doing differently in their schools? Yeah, $1 million question, isn't it? I think that one, we'd all like to know that, I think. You know, we don't really put enough emphasis on finding out what it is. I think it's a combination of things. You know, in fact, I was having this conversation today about families and whether engineering is a kind of culturally acceptable career for girls to go into. And in this country, it's not so much, but in other countries, it absolutely is. Other countries and other cultures, it is. Yeah, I think we could do a lot by comparing what other countries do better than we do. Yeah, what do you think?
Well, do you want to take more questions, or?
You answer.
Just make maybe a quick comment. So I'm from Iraq originally. My parents are here, and that we were never told that engineering isn't for women. I was actually quite surprised when I arrived at university to find myself one of a few girls there. So that was a bit of a shock to me. But yeah, in the Middle East, there's not really that perception.
That's very interesting. So, sorry, just here. There was somebody right at the back. I can't see them.
Thank you. Sort of following on from what everybody's saying, I wonder if it would be useful to know what the professors are working on, what research is going on. Make us link the huge need for recycling. We don't need these incinerators anymore and the heat power coming from burning. You know, we know what we don't need. What is going on in engineering, which is so interesting?
I don't know whether you...
I think in theory, that would be great, but we are competing with everything else that's in the media. So I think researchers and engineering companies do try to put those good news stories out there, but you're competing with every other industry that's competing for that airtime, if that makes sense. So it's quite challenging in practice.
But there is a lot going on, you know, there is a lot of research going on, but not necessarily enough, I don't think. I'm on one of the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, EPSRC they're called, and research money still goes into projects that are deemed excellent, not into projects that are climate change projects that are excellent,
but any project that is excellent, which is fine, you know, when you've got lots of time and you're not in a climate emergency. But for me, I would put more of our research money into those problems that absolutely need solving, and, you know, really talk about the solutions that are out there. And I think that's a way of attracting more people into thinking about those solutions. And young people as innovators as well as entrepreneurs. And, you know, there's a lot of money to be made. These are business decisions as well that where money is. So, yeah, I think
we've just got time for one more question, and there's a woman there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Dawn Bonfield, you mentioned that you are an inclusion engineer. I'd like to learn a bit more, if you could explain what that is and how you do it.
Yeah, so inclusive engineering is a way of trying to make sure that what we create as engineers is accessible. So the examples that we know about very easily are things like the seat belts in cars, where, you know, we don't make seat belts that are suitable for pregnant women. We make systems like transport systems that don't understand how people use those systems, so they favour one group of the population over a different group of the population. But it's also about how we look at things like the provenance of materials. I'm a materials engineer, so it's where we extract materials from for the renewable energy systems of the future, and the impact that extraction is having on those countries, on their water supply, on their biodiversity, on their economy, because we're taking value out of a lot of these countries. But as engineers, we don't necessarily get visibility of these things when we're making decisions. So we need, you know, what we know as materials engineers is we know the strength and the cost and the availability, but we don't know those sort of human, ethical consequences of certain things. So inclusive engineering is the whole picture of the impact that's having on people, whether it's people as end users of a product, or whether it's people on the other end from where those materials are being extracted from. Thanks, Dawn.
I think I'm afraid we're going to have to stop, but please do stay around and we'll answer your questions afterwards if we can. But before we go, I just wanted to ask each of you to go back to our original subject this evening, what it is about Caroline Haslett and the EAW that makes them important today, do you think, Anne?
I mean, I'd say it was just such an amazing kind of pioneering idea, but actually, if you've got a massive industry that's affecting women's lives, that you should ask women about it first. And I think Caroline has had a kind of this kind of very strange idea that would be a good plan. And I think we can still learn a lot from that. But we should actually ask people what they need rather than just assuming we know what they want.
Very good answer. Do you have any thoughts, Dawn, about what her legacy and what it means to you?
We should all be a little bit more like Caroline Haslett, who was an absolute activist and campaigner and somebody who got things done. And I think, you know, we all need to take action for the future that we want.
And what about you, Yasmin?
I think my reflection is that she managed to do all that in an environment that's a lot tougher than where we are today. So that gives me hope for maybe what I can achieve going forward.
Yes, an inspiration. Yes, well, thank you. And so, unfortunately, we've run out of time, so I need to wrap up now. And so thank you all again for joining us, and whether you're here in the great room or online. And thank you for your excellent questions. And I thank you in particular to my wonderful fellow speakers, Anne, Dawn and Yasmin. And also, of course, many thanks to the RSA Fellowship for hosting us this evening. And if tonight has whetted your appetite, we'll be gathering again on the 12th of November at the IET for Electric Dreams, commemorating the actual anniversary of the founding of the Electrical Association for Women. We'll be celebrating women in energy, past, present and future. And there's still a few tickets left, so you can click on the QR code on screen or on the link in the YouTube chat for more information and to book your place. But for now, please feel free to stay on, continue the discussion at the bookstall or in the foyer or downstairs in the RSA bar. So thank you again and good night.